The missing key to the locked village history, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a key. Old, iron, and long thought lost to the village's past. It wasn't just any key. It could unlock doors no one had dared open for decades. When a hidden letter surfaces, hinting at secrets buried deep. Miss Marple knows this key is more than a relic. It is a doorway to lies, betrayals, and truth someone wanted forgotten. As she follows the trail, from dusty attics to locked cellars, she discovers that history isn't always written in books. Sometimes, it waits quietly behind a locked door. Before we unlock the secrets of the village, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries. Chapter 1: The Missing Key to the Locked Village History. The village of St. Alder's Hollow had always been proud of its past. Too proud, some would say. Its cobbled lanes, its leaning cottages, its weather-worn church, all whispered stories that the villagers repeated like cherished hymns. Yet there were parts of that past no one spoke of aloud. Miss Jane Marple knew this well. She sat beside the window of her small drawing room, knitting needles moving with quiet purpose, while her sharp eyes followed the slow drift of winter clouds beyond the hedges. From this very window, she had watched St. Alder's Hollow for decades. She had seen children grow old, friendships rot, and secrets settle into the soil like buried bones. History, Miss Marple often thought, was rarely what people claimed it to be. The letter arrived just after noon. It was delivered by young Thomas Reed, who lingered a little too long at the gate, clearly hoping for conversation. Miss Marple thanked him kindly, waited until his footsteps faded, and then studied the envelope with care. There was no return address. The paper was thick, expensive. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, and unfamiliar. Inside was a single sentence. The key is gone. And with it, the truth. Miss Marple read the words twice. Then a third time. Her knitting needles stopped mid-stitch. The village archive. That was where the key belonged. St. Alder's Hollow kept its records locked away in a narrow stone room behind the church vestry. Births, deaths, land deeds, council minutes, every official trace of village life stretching back over 200 years. The door to that archive was secured by a heavy iron lock, opened only by a single brass key. A key that had never, in living memory, gone missing. Miss Marple rose slowly, folded the letter, and placed it into her handbag. This was not mischief. This was not carelessness. This was intent. The church stood silent when she arrived, its grey stones darkened by age and rain. Inside, the scent of polish and old wood lingered in the air. Reverend Collins was nowhere to be seen, but the vestry door stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple stepped inside. The archive room lay beyond, its narrow entrance framed by shelves of hymn books. The lock was intact. Solid. Untouched. But the keyhole was empty. Miss Marple felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, but recognition. She had seen this before in other places, other lives. When something vital disappeared, it was rarely the beginning of trouble. It was the continuation of it. Miss Marple. She turned to see Margaret Ellis, the church warden, standing rigid near the doorway. Margaret's face was pale, her mouth tight with worry. "It's gone," Margaret said. "The key? I checked this morning. It was here yesterday." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And who knew where it was kept?" Margaret hesitated. "The council members. The Reverend Mr. Hawthorne from the Historical Society. And, well, a few others, over the years." "A few others." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is quite enough, my dear." By evening, the village was buzzing. Rumors spread faster than truth ever could. Some said the archive hid proof of stolen land. Others whispered of a child who had vanished long ago, never officially recorded. A few claimed there were letters, dangerous letters, that named names best forgotten. Miss Marple listened. She always did. At the post office, Mrs. Grant lowered her voice. At the bakery, Mr. Simmons spoke too quickly. At the pub, silence fell whenever certain villagers entered the room. Patterns emerged, as they always did. Not everyone was afraid the key was missing. Some looked relieved. That night, Miss Marple reviewed the village history in her mind. One story, in particular, stood out. 30 years ago, a fire had destroyed the old manor on the hill. Officially, it had been an accident. But the owner, Harold Whitcomb, had died inside, his body found near a locked study. No key was ever found then either. And now, once again, a missing key. Miss Marple folded her hands and stared into the fire. History did not repeat itself, she believed. But people did. The next morning brought another development. A second letter. This one delivered by hand, slipped beneath Miss Marple's door. If the archive opens, the village falls. Miss Marple read the words carefully, then smiled, not with amusement, but with certainty. Someone was afraid. Very afraid. And fear, Miss Marple knew, was the surest sign that the truth was close. She placed the letter beside the first. 2 messages. 1 warning. 1 threat. The missing key was not merely metal and teeth. It was control. Control over the past. Control over what could be proven, and what would remain rumor forever. Miss Marple picked up her handbag once more. "It seems," she said softly to the empty room, "that St. Alder's Hollow has locked away more than records." And she intended to unlock every last secret, key or no key at all. Chapter 2: Shadows Behind the Locked Records. The loss of the key changed the village in ways that were subtle at first, yet unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. Doors were closed more quietly. Conversations ended when footsteps approached. Smiles lingered a fraction too long, as though worn for protection rather than warmth. Miss Marple noticed everything. She noticed how Mrs. Grant began locking her post office door during lunch hours, something she had never done before. She noticed how Mr. Hawthorne, once so eager to lecture on village history, now avoided the subject entirely. She noticed how Reverend Collins spoke more often of forgiveness than truth. These were not coincidences. They were symptoms. The locked archive had become more than a room. It had become a threat. Miss Marple chose her questions carefully, for careless inquiry only taught people how to lie better. Instead, she listened, letting others fill the silence with their own anxieties. In such moments, people revealed far more than they intended. At the weekly council meeting, held in the modest hall near the green, tension sat heavily in the air. The long wooden table bore scratches from decades of debate, yet tonight, no one argued. They waited. Margaret Ellis cleared her throat. Until the key is found, the archive remains closed. Mr. Hawthorne shifted in his seat. That is precisely the problem. The village cannot function if its records are inaccessible. Or, said Councillor Benton slowly, perhaps it functions better that way. The silence that followed was thick and deliberate. Miss Marple watched Mr. Hawthorne's hands. They trembled slightly as he folded them together, then unfolded them again. A man who loved history did not fear it unless it had teeth. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Whitcomb Manor ruins. The fire had taken the roof and much of the interior, but the stone walls still stood, blackened and stubborn. Ivy crawled over the remains, as though trying to erase what memory refused to forget. Harold Whitcomb had been a difficult man, proud and private, fond of locked doors. His death had been ruled accidental, yet the village had accepted the verdict too quickly, too eagerly. Miss Marple walked slowly through the broken archway where the study had once been. She knelt near the spot where the body had been found and brushed aside loose dirt with her gloved hand. There were no clues left here. There rarely were, after so many years. But absence itself could be revealing. Back then, no key had been found. No one had questioned why a man known for guarding his privacy would lock himself in without a means of escape. No one had pressed the matter, because doing so would have required questions the village was not prepared to answer. Miss Marple straightened and sighed softly. The past was patient. It waited until people were tired of pretending. That evening brought another disturbance. A rumor reached Miss Marple's ears through Mrs. Simmons, who had heard it from her nephew, who claimed to have overheard it at the pub. The chain of delivery was weak, yet the message was clear. Someone had been seen near the church late at night. Not praying. Watching. Miss Marple did not sleep well. Her thoughts returned again and again to the missing key, to the letters, to the careful choice of words. Whoever was behind this was educated, deliberate, and deeply invested in controlling what could be known. Fear alone did not drive such behavior. Fear was only the beginning. The following morning, she visited the home of Arthur Bell, the oldest resident of St. Alder's Hollow. Arthur was nearly 90, his memory unreliable in trivial matters, yet sharp when it came to old wounds. He greeted her warmly, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Miss Marple. Come in, come in. Not many care to hear old stories these days." "Oh, but I do," she replied gently. "Especially the ones no one writes down." Arthur chuckled, then coughed, then grew serious. "You're asking about the archive, aren't you?" "I am," Miss Marple admitted. Arthur leaned back in his chair. There were changes made years ago. Quiet ones. Pages removed. Entries rewritten. Not by accident. Who would have done such a thing? Miss Marple asked. Arthur's gaze drifted toward the window. People with influence. People who believed the village belonged to them. He paused, then added, and people who had something to lose. Names were not spoken, but they did not need to be. Miss Marple thanked him and left, her thoughts heavy. The archive did not merely record history. It shaped it. By afternoon, the tension reached a breaking point. Reverend Collins announced that a temporary solution had been found. Copies of certain records would be made available, carefully selected, of course, to ensure nothing sensitive was disturbed. Miss Marple recognized the tactic at once. Control through compromise. She attended the viewing of these copies, noting what was present and, more importantly, what was missing. Land transfers stopped abruptly at certain years. Birth records lacked surnames. Death certificates listed causes without context. The gaps were intentional. As she turned to leave, she noticed Margaret Ellis standing alone, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. "Margaret," Miss Marple said softly, "has anyone threatened you?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "I thought keeping quiet would protect everyone." "It rarely does," Miss Marple replied gently. That night, the third letter arrived. This one was shorter. "You are asking the wrong questions." Miss Marple smiled faintly as she folded it. "No," she murmured. "I am asking precisely the right ones." The shadows behind the locked records were growing longer, darker, more desperate. And desperation, Miss Marple knew, always made people careless. The key was missing. But the truth was beginning to turn its own lock. Chapter 3: The Key That Unlocked the Village Truth. The truth did not arrive suddenly. It crept forward, piece by piece, until the village could no longer pretend it was unaware of its shape. Miss Marple awoke before dawn, her mind clear in a way that comes only after long contemplation. The letters, the missing records, the altered pages, the fearful silences, all pointed in the same direction. This was not about one crime or one secret, but a careful reshaping of the past. Someone had rewritten the story of St. Alder's Hollow. The church bell rang once as the sky lightened, its sound carrying across empty streets. Miss Marple dressed carefully and made her way toward the green, where she knew the truth would finally be spoken, whether the village wished it or not. By mid-morning, the council hall was full. Villagers sat shoulder to shoulder, murmuring softly, eyes darting toward the front of the room. Margaret Ellis stood near the doorway, pale but resolute. Reverend Collins sat stiffly at the table, his hands folded as though in prayer. Mr. Hawthorne avoided everyone's gaze, staring down at the polished wood. Miss Marple took her seat quietly. She waited. When the meeting was called to order, Reverend Collins spoke first. He spoke of unity, of peace, of the dangers of disturbing old wounds. His words were gentle, yet they rang hollow. Miss Marple rose slowly. "With respect," she said, her voice calm but firm, "peace built on falsehood is only silence, and silence is the most dangerous thing of all. Every eye turned toward her. She continued, unhurried, allowing each word to settle. The archive was not merely locked. It was altered. Pages were removed decades ago, entries rewritten, names erased. This was done to hide an unlawful transfer of land following the fire at Whitcomb Manor. A murmur swept through the room. Miss Marple turned toward Mr. Hawthorne. You were not merely a historian. You were a participant. Your family benefited from land that never belonged to them, land taken after Harold Whitcomb's death, before questions could be asked. Mr. Hawthorne's face drained of color. The missing key, Miss Marple went on, was taken not to prevent discovery, but to delay it. You hoped to buy time, to create confusion, perhaps even fear. But you underestimated the patience of truth. Mr. Hawthorne stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You have no proof, he said, his voice trembling. The records are locked away. Miss Marple smiled gently. Not entirely. She reached into her handbag and produced a small bundle of papers, yellowed with age. Arthur Bell kept copies. He did not trust the changes being made. He hid them, quietly, for years. She handed the papers to Margaret Ellis, who read them slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to horror. The room was silent. The fire at Whitcomb Manor, Miss Marple continued, was not an accident. Harold Whitcomb discovered the altered records and confronted those responsible. He was locked in his study. The missing key from that night was disposed of, just as you attempted to dispose of this one. Reverend Collins bowed his head. You knew, Miss Marple said gently. You all knew, or suspected, and you chose silence. But silence is a decision, and decisions have consequences. Mr. Hawthorne collapsed back into his chair, defeated. We thought we were protecting the village, he whispered. You were protecting yourselves, Miss Marple replied. The village survived despite the lie, not because of it. The authorities were contacted before sunset. The archive was opened using a newly forged key, its lock yielding at last. The truth, once hidden, spread quickly, as truth always does. Some villagers were angry. Others were ashamed. A few felt relieved. Miss Marple returned home as dusk settled over St. Alder's Hollow. She placed the letters into her drawer, alongside other reminders of human frailty. Outside, the village lights flickered on, one by one, illuminating streets that felt lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted. History had been restored, not rewritten. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting once more, her reflection faint in the glass. Secrets, she murmured, are never truly locked away. They are only waiting. The village would heal. It always did. But it would never forget, and that was as it should be. The missing key had unlocked more than a door. It had unlocked the courage to face the past. And if you enjoyed uncovering this mystery, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with fellow lovers of classic detective tales. More mysteries await, and the next secret is already waiting to be discovered.